The winter mist hung low over the valley, swallowing the treetops and muffling every sound, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Patrols had reported unusual silence along the ridgeline, the kind that made seasoned officers uneasy. Maps offered no comfort. Every contour seemed to hide a dozen possibilities. For the men of the infantry company dug in below, the fear wasn't what they could see, but what they couldn't. Something was waiting out there, something big enough to kill them before they even understood the shape of the threat. Among them was a quiet private who kept mostly to himself, a man known more for tinkering than talking. He carried no special rank, no medals, and no reputation beyond the odd contraptions he fashioned from scraps of wood and metal wire. His latest creation, a pocket-sized periscope carved from salvaged mirror shards and whittled timber, had become the running joke of the platoon. They called it a toy, a waste of time, something only a bored recruit would bother with. But he kept working on it, smoothing edges, adjusting angles, testing joints like he believed it could make a difference. On the morning the valley went silent, he slipped his little device into his coat and climbed into the frost-bitten trenches. The others laughed, nudging one another as he crouched near the parapet with his toy periscope clutched in his gloves. But the moment he raised it above the trench lip, the laughter died in the cold air. Because what he saw wasn't empty terrain, and it wasn't a harmless quiet. His mirror had caught the faintest ripple of movement, too coordinated, too numerous, too deliberate. An entire line of assault troops lay hidden across the ridge, perfectly arranged and seconds from launching a devastating attack. The hours before dawn stretched thin, each minute wrapped in fog and the bitter scent of frozen earth. Along the forward trenches, soldiers paced in stiff silence, rubbing numb hands together, checking gear that had already been checked a dozen times. Even the wind seemed afraid to stir. It was the kind of morning that made imagination dangerous. Every shadow held a shape, every gust whispered a threat. They waited for orders, for noise, for anything that would break the oppressive stillness. The private knelt near the forward edge of the trench, brushing frost off the wooden frame of his device. The men passing behind him spared only dismissive glances, whispering jokes about the childish gadget he carried. He heard them, but didn't react. Something about the silence bothered him, something beyond nerves, something patterned. He eased the periscope upward, letting its small mirrored head peek inches above the sandbags. His breath steamed as he steadied his hands, adjusting for the faint tremor running through him. What he saw made the blood drain from his face. There, just beyond the natural fold of the ridge, where the land sloped into shadow, a row of dark shapes lay prone. Helmets, shoulders, barrels angled forward, barely visible through the haze but unmistakably alive. Not one figure, not a handful. Rows, dozens, maybe more. The enemy had burrowed into the terrain with patient precision, waiting for the exact moment to strike the valley wide open. He lowered the periscope slowly, aware that if he dropped it, the crack of the mirror might be the loudest sound in the valley. His heart thumped hard enough to hurt. He looked toward the command dugout, hesitating, wondering if anyone would take him seriously after weeks of jokes about his inventions. The thought chilled him. What if he spoke up and they brushed him aside? What if speaking up saved them all? Another soldier passed, chuckling as he nudged the wooden device with his boot. The private didn't respond. Instead, he raised the periscope again, scanning in tiny, careful increments. More movement. A hand signal. The glint of metal as a breech snapped shut. They weren't waiting much longer. He felt a tightening in his throat, a sudden urgency that burned away his self-doubt. Whether they mocked him or not, the truth was staring at him through the mirror. He moved fast toward the platoon sergeant, boots crunching in the thin crust of frost. When he arrived breathless at the dugout entrance, the sergeant eyed him with mild annoyance, expecting another minor report or trivial concern. But the private's voice didn't tremble, and he didn't mince words. He explained exactly what he had seen, how many troops, how they were arranged, and where they were preparing to breach. The sergeant's expression shifted, irritation replaced with something colder, attention. The sergeant led him back to the trench edge, ordering 2 riflemen to keep watch while the private set up the device again. The men exchanged smirks as the little periscope rose above the sandbags. The sergeant squinted through the mirrored angle, adjusting it until the ridge snapped into focus. His posture stiffened, his jaw clenched. In the reflection, he saw the unmistakable silhouettes the private had described: calm, patient, deadly. The sergeant yanked the device down, muttering a curse. In seconds, runners were dispatched down the line, relaying the discovery to the company commander. The quiet valley transformed. Men rushed to firing positions, machine guns were unshrouded, mortars calibrated, and the entire trench began humming with controlled intensity. The private felt the world shift, as though the air itself recognized the approaching storm. But beneath the action, a new fear crept in. The enemy line was perfectly positioned to break through and overrun them. The private understood one thing clearly: spotting them might not be enough. The defenders needed more: clear angles, precise distances, exact numbers. Someone had to keep eyes on the ridge, and only one tool could do it from cover without exposing a man's skull to the first rifle round. The private withdrew into a small, dug-in firing position and steadied his breathing. His fingers ached with cold as he adjusted the tiny mirrors, aligning them for long-range observation. Others crowded around, no longer laughing, but not yet trusting, waiting to hear what the toy could reveal next. He pressed it upward, rotating slowly, sweeping for changes in the enemy movement. At first, the line seemed unchanged, but then he caught another signal: 2 short gestures, followed by the distinct shift of bodies preparing to rise. The assault was minutes away. He relayed the information to a runner who bolted down the trench at full speed. The periscope's view trembled as the private shifted, following a group of shadowed figures dragging a heavy weapon into position. Behind him, officers scrambled to recalculate defensive arcs. Machine gun teams reset their fields of fire. Mortar crews readied high-explosive shells, calculating angles based on the private's hurried estimates. Every detail mattered. The enemy had chosen their terrain perfectly. If the defenders misjudged by even a few yards, the first wave would break through. As he scanned the ridge again, he noticed something new: wet soil, freshly displaced. A hidden approach tunnel or trench extension had been carved into the hillside. It was narrow, almost invisible, but the mirrored lens of his device caught the faint shimmer of disturbed dirt. That channel would have allowed the assault force to surge forward without exposing themselves to rifle fire. It was their path straight into the defensive line. He relayed the discovery, and the officers immediately shifted their fire plans. Mortar teams pivoted to target the new coordinates, re-aiming to seal the hidden approach before it could be used. The private kept adjusting, marking subtle details in the terrain that most would overlook: patterns in snow, shadows that didn't match the slope, boot marks half covered by drifting frost. While he worked, the soldiers behind him began to see the device differently. The jokes vanished. Some whispered quietly about how the thing even worked. Others simply watched, solemn and still, understanding that the little scrap-built periscope was now the single most important tool in the trench. A sudden crack echoed from the ridge, a rifle shot, a warning. The private jerked back instinctively, pressing against the trench wall as a bullet sliced into the sandbags above him. The enemy had spotted the glint of the mirror, or the shifting of snow around the device's tip. The men ducked, cursing as they tried to pinpoint the shooter. Another crack, then another. The assault was about to begin. He knew he had only seconds to survey the ridge before the first wave charged. Ignoring the shouts to pull back, He raised the periscope once more, keeping it at a lower angle, using the terrain's natural dips to obscure its profile. Through the shaking mirror, he saw movement. Lines of soldiers rising to their knees, checking weapons, gripping the edges of the hillside. He counted them as fast as he could. Tens, dozens, scores. The enemy was deploying far broader than expected, stretching across the entire ridge, ready to hit the defenders from multiple angles. He ducked down, gasping, and relayed the number. It changed everything. The captain personally ordered the fire teams into new positions, shifting resources from the center to the flanks. What had looked like a straightforward assault had transformed into a sweeping, multi-pronged strike designed to overwhelm the valley defenders by sheer force. But now they were ready. The men held their breaths, watching the ridge through the rising mist. The first figures appeared. Dark shapes breaking the skyline in coordinated movements. The defenders waited, still as stone. A machine gunner whispered a curse, gripping his weapon tighter, waiting for the order to fire. The private readied his periscope again, not for spotting, but for tracking the speed and direction of the attack so he could guide the gunners. Suddenly, the ridge erupted. Enemy troops surged forward in disciplined waves, shadows turning into bodies, bodies into threats. The valley exploded with noise, rifles cracking, machine guns roaring, mortars thumping. The defenders unleashed everything. The private stayed low, inches from the trench wall, moving his periscope in short arcs to track the assault's shifts. Every time he saw a squad diverge, he shouted the direction. Machine gun teams adjusted, mortars recalculated, riflemen focused fire where he directed. The tiny mirrors reflected chaos, enemy troops darting through smoke, shadows flickering as explosions tore through the ground. The battle raged across the valley floor, the mist turning red and white as shrapnel sliced through it. Enemy forces advanced in staggered lines, ducking behind natural depressions, trying to reach the hidden approach trench the private had exposed earlier. But every time they neared it, a volley of fire met them, driving them back in desperate scrambles. The defenders were holding, but only barely. Ammunition crates ran low, and machine guns hissed with overheating barrels. The private realized the enemy was shifting again, opening a new path through a snow-covered depression that looked insignificant from ground level, but obvious from his mirrored vantage. He relayed the new path just as the enemy funneled into it, turning what should have been a blind spot into a trap. The defenders reoriented instantly, unleashing a wall of fire that tore through the advancing troops. The assault line staggered, momentum faltering. Officers on the ridge signaled frantically, trying to redirect the attack. The private swept his periscope toward the far left of the ridge and froze. A second assault group had moved into position, larger than the first. They had stayed hidden during the entire battle, waiting for the defenders to commit their fire to the central wave. The plan was brilliant. Overwhelm the center, then flank with overwhelming force. He reported the discovery instantly. Commanders shifted the last reserve squads into position, anticipating the flanking maneuver. They crouched low, rifles aimed, preparing for a fight at spitting distance. Moments later, the second wave rose from the mist and met a prepared defense instead of an exposed flank. The valley transformed into a thunder of gunfire. The new wave advanced aggressively, believing surprise was on their side. Instead, they walked into a curtain of rifle fire and machine gun bursts that stalled their momentum before they reached the halfway point. The ridge erupted with smoke as the attackers scrambled for cover. The private scanned again. He caught a brief flash, officers regrouping behind a cluster of rocks, signaling desperately for the remnants of the first wave to push again. He tracked the officers' location carefully, relaying their movements to the mortar team. Moments later, a pair of shells arced overhead and detonated in a thunderous spray of dirt and rock, breaking the enemy's coordination. The enemy began to falter. Gaps formed in their lines. Hesitation spread like wildfire. What was meant to be a decisive, crushing assault was unraveling, every move countered by defenders who somehow seemed to know exactly where they would strike next. As the attackers pulled back, their formations becoming ragged, the private kept scanning, ensuring no third wave lingered in reserve. Exhaustion set into his muscles, but he kept the periscope high, sweeping over the battlefield like a second pair of eyes for every soldier in the trench. Finally, he saw it: the retreat. Enemy troops began withdrawing in scattered groups, dragging the wounded, abandoning equipment, disappearing back into the same ridges they had emerged from hours earlier. The assault had collapsed under the weight of constant, precise defensive fire. When the gunfire quieted, the valley fell into a thick, trembling silence. Smoke drifted like torn curtains over the frozen ground. The defenders slowly lifted their heads above the parapets, stunned by the scale of what they had repelled. Officers moved through the trenches, checking on casualties, stunned by how narrow their victory had been. Behind them, the private sat with the periscope resting in his lap, breathing hard. Frost clung to his coat. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just passed. The captain approached quietly, his boots crunching over spent casings and frozen mud. He stopped in front of the private, studying the little device that had changed the course of the entire battle. Without ceremony, he picked it up, turning it in his hand, the wooden joints still damp with frost, the mirrors scratched but intact. He nodded once, a single, simple gesture of recognition. Word spread through the trench. Soldiers who had mocked the device hours earlier now moved closer, not to laugh, but to look, really look, at the tool that had saved them. The private didn't bask in the attention. He simply sat there, exhausted, staring at the ridge where countless lives had waited to destroy them. By evening, engineers were already asking him how he'd built it, marking sketches, taking measurements. Officers discussed issuing similar devices to reconnaissance teams. The valley remained quiet now, not the ominous quiet of dawn, but the exhausted quiet of survival. And though no one ever carved his name into a medal or painted his face on a poster, the men who fought beside him never forgot how a simple wooden periscope, laughed at as a child's toy, had exposed an entire hidden assault line and saved them all.